So welcome back to the video series. This is Kevin Schanilec, and we are on the third in our series of videos we're recording about the Fetter approach. His website is called simplythescene.com, all one word, and that will be linked underneath this video. If you haven't seen the other two videos, check out the playlist called Fetters with Kevin Schanilec on my YouTube channel, and you can watch all of them in order. Today we're talking about the seventh fetter, and this is Kevin.
Thank you, Angelo. Thanks for having me again.
Yeah, thanks for coming. So we finished the last video, the sixth fetter, discussing some of the sort of effects of that occur or that you may notice once that fetter falls. Maybe we could just briefly touch on that and review that as a sort of starting place and then move into how we might investigate the seventh.
That's a great idea. So the sixth fetter was the illusion that we are the subject, not just something, but the central thing in life. Everything we experience is in relationship to us. It helps us to reinforce our identity by keeping us separate from, everything else. Even our thoughts seem separate from us. Once that fetter falls and you see there's nothing about you that is a subject or could possibly function as that, then the perceived separation between you and everything else starts to soften. One of the side effects could be that you don't have what appears to be a really stark three-dimensional depth of your visual field. Everything can start to flatten out. One of the big things, though, is that you will notice that you no longer refer back to yourself. How do I feel about what's happening? Doesn't mean you become completely blasé about what's happening in your life, but you're able to just be with what is happening without being as concerned about what you think and feel about it.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really good way to put it. It's a nice big step toward, you might say, selflessness in one sense, that you don't, the self-obsession definitely calms for sure. Realizing not only that there's not a separation between the subject or what experience is experienced as a me or a self or a center and the objective world, but also the disproportionate importance of what feels like that center or that me. It's just, it can't stand anymore. It doesn't really have a footing.
Right, that it's still there, but it starts to lose its footing, and with the falling of the sixth fetter, who and what you are comes into question.
Yeah.
And you can start to have any number of possible side effects. You might go through a bout of nihilism. You can start to wonder, well, what's the point if things aren't as they've always appeared to me? There's lots of ways that you might say the me or the I that is trying to maintain its identity, it will start throwing things at you as if something's wrong. And actually, something's been wrong all along, and it's now been corrected.
Exactly. Sometimes it can be a surprising amount of grief or discomfort when you're letting go of what was always an illusion, and yet something inside still can react as if it's something real that's being lost. But it always seems to settle out nicely when you realize it wasn't there, didn't need to be there, never really did any good.
Right, and it's always just been like this.
Yeah. So then once that shift occurs, and it's usually pretty obvious, what you would recommend maybe people would take a little bit of time, again, as we mentioned before starting to look deeper or looking more into perception and form and so forth?
Yes, I'd always recommend taking a break just to let it become the new normal. See if anything starts to seem, inordinately wrong. Also, one of the functions of our identity is to manage trauma. So trauma might start to come out, and it might be a good time to stop and look at that as well.
Yeah, and so you mentioned before potential for therapy if needed and so forth. Do you have any other recommendations or other things you've seen work for people who need to still do some trauma work or that feel that coming up?
It really does vary. One of the things I tell people is that as you awaken, one thing that's not going to change is your library of memories and, you might say, pre-programmed responses to whatever is happening.
Mm-hmm.
It's not like life becomes suddenly perfect.
Mm.
Therefore, as things come up, you can start to see, oh yeah, that is part of my library.
Mm-hmm.
If someone cuts me off on the freeway, I have certain hand gestures that are appropriate. Or as a memory from childhood comes up, there it is again, and here I go into this pre-programmed response, from my library, you might say.
Mm-hmm.
So it might be more and more easy to not only notice these, but also to work with them, such as with a trained therapist.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Excellent. All right. So when we decide to start digging into the next Fetter, how do you recommend starting to work with that?
So it's just like any other Fetter. There's something about you that you think you have. In this case, it's no longer what you presume makes you the central thing among all other things. It's what makes you and everything else a thing at all, or what you might call a something. More specifically, it's something that seems to be in here somewhere that allows us to perceive other things that are just as real as we are. In particular, we come to believe at, I don't even know what age that might be, but that we have a body and we have a mind. And those are real things. Those are some things. This is what you might call the middle step of tearing away or removing the sense of duality we have. The most fundamental is our identity as me or I. It may not seem like a duality, but it is. Mm-hmm. Then on top of that, we build the seventh Fetter, which gives us the sense that we have a mind and body. Everything else we see is just as real as we are. And then the sixth Fetter puts everything into a relationship. I'm the most important thing. I'm the central thing. So in this second step, we get to see if we really are perceiving actual somethings, or if that's just an interpretation in our mind. Mm-hmm. And as it turns out, it's just an interpretation.
So how would you recommend somebody start to directly investigate that?
The first thing I always recommend is to get a sense of what a something is. Something that seems tangible, real, is out there in three-dimensional space, has boundaries, exists in and of itself, and it seems like it was just waiting for us to observe it. So the first exercise I have is often just, it's a continuation of what I recommend for the sixth Fetter, what I call the turning toward exercise, where you just put something at the edge of your periphery and you start to turn your body towards it, keeping your gaze straight out from your body, until perhaps at a 45-degree angle, it starts to become something. Mm-hmm. Whatever it is, a lamp, a clock, it starts to be real and tangible. Maybe a strong sense of three-dimensional depth comes in. So just getting a sense of how tangible and real you normally assume everything you see is. Mm-hmm. You can also see with this exercise that if you turn away from it again, it's no longer a something. Mm-hmm. It might be like billboards passing you on the freeway. They're there, but you really don't notice them. They don't seem like something until you look directly at them. By this, you can see that what we call perception is not a passive process. One of the adjectives or a set of adjectives to use for the perceptual process is we not just detect something, but we apprehend it. We might even seem like we're mentally grasping at it. We resolve what it is, where exactly it is. Of course, we may not have ever noticed how that isn't a passive process. It might seem like we're just in here in our head going about our business, and everything else out there just presents itself, and we see it as it is, without any interpretation.
I think I love that you said it that way, that perception is not a passive process, but it happens so, I would say maybe it's a habituated process. It happens so quickly that we don't even realize we're skipping over steps of processing where we are literally imputing form and distance and so forth onto and reality onto objects seemingly out there and so forth. So almost a step in just the maturity of seeing this is to recognize, oh, I actually might be doing something here that I don't realize I'm doing. So yeah, I just wanted to point that out.
Right, and after this fetter falls, you'll still be able to recognize things. What this fetter looks at, though, is what happens after that recognition happens. We start to make things tangible and real inside our minds. Whereas actually, we just recognize something that we remembered, oh, that's a glass of water.
Yeah, that's an important point as well, that it's not as if you're non-functional in a world of formlessness without the ability to use the normal sort of mental apparatus to navigate three-dimensional worlds and so forth. You still know, conventionally speaking, that's a cup, but that's there's nothing really there. There's no there even.
Right. One way to put it is you still have to interpret your sensory experience to get across the street. The thing is, you no longer misinterpret it. You no longer take that next step and say, oh, that's tangible, real, just like I'm tangible and real. One of the, you might call it a pitfall of this step, is that the tendency is to look outside of ourselves and start to think about, well, that maybe that's not as real as I think it is, and I know that that's just an interpretation. But as with all the other fetters, the inquiry is really in here. There's something that you think you have that allows you to see everything that's tangible and real.
That's
so this isn't about the way things are.
Yeah.
It's about the way I'm really not.
Man, that is such an important point.
Yeah, and one, I think maybe it was the last interview or maybe the first one, you mentioned that the field of neuroscience is interested in, well, basically what we're talking about in these interviews. And I've done some reading particularly pertinent to the seventh fetter. And I have no commercial stake in this, but Being You by Anil Seth is one of the books I've read recently, and there's a lot of things in there that really resonated as true. He says that we think we have a transparent window out into what's happening to this mind-independent reality, whereas actually what happens is we think the outside comes into us, but really our experience is more inside out. We take what we see, and based on what we think it is, what we expect it is, we project a certain version of what we see onto our experience and assume, oh, well, I'm seeing it just as it is. Whereas actually it's just you're being presented with something and you're interpreting it. He calls that a controlled hallucination. It's an hallucination because it's not quite what's really happening, and it's controlled in that what you're seeing is controlled by what happens to be in the room. For example, this is a blue glass of water. It's not like I would look at that and think it's an elephant. There is, it's not completely random what's going on. It's just we take what's happening and impute a certain degree of tangibility and reality onto it. So I think this fetter is one in which the field of neuroscience and the unfettering approach could really do some interesting work together.
Yeah. Just as and then, again, it's an aside because I like to point out to people that it is really interesting how neuroscience is catching up. When you read about the default mode network and the experience of subject-object, that is a subnetwork of that, as well as the sense of the self in time, which is another subnetwork. It's really interesting. And but again, this, in my experience, this has to be resolved in direct experience or in inquiry rather than understanding. So. But the other aspect of that that's fascinating is the in our cerebral cortex, the occipital lobe, which is back here, and that processes the visual field, which is the most active lobe most of the time because it's constantly doing work. And at the very center is a thing called the thalamus, which takes sensory information and shoots it onto the cerebral cortex, essentially, that says, okay, here's the visual information, here's the auditory information, now process it and create something out of it. But with the visual cortex, the occipital lobe, it has just as many neurons that are actually projecting from the visual cortex back to the thalamus. So it's literally re-imputing this experience back onto the world, saying this is how it is, and then feeding it back to itself as this three-dimensional structured, world of objects and so forth. So there's a ton of information that's required to even create that sense of duality. And that's what's so interesting about this, that you realize, wow, there's a deep rest underneath when this fetter calms or falls that's available.
Yeah, it takes a lot of energy to live in this three-dimensional world that we have to constantly create. It's like we're a three-dimensional video card that is constantly drawing energy from your power supply just to keep redrawing what it is we believe we're seeing.
Yeah. So we talked about the sort of, I can't remember the term used, but the scanning where we pick something up in the periphery and sort of follow it to the central vision,
right,
or shuffle the feet and turn until you start to see that it appears suddenly as an actual object, something solid, something with distance and depth and so forth. And then we can even reverse that by moving away and seeing that suddenly it's more like undifferentiated visual information again. Once we maybe have worked with that some, are there other inquiries or other approaches you recommend to start to dig into this?
Yes. So the next step I often suggest is to, again, intentionally interrupt that perceptual process. It can be as simple as looking at something for a moment and get a sense of, oh yeah, this feels like a tangible three-dimensional something out there. And just letting your vision blur, and suddenly it's not a something. And then maybe just blink your eyes and allow it to snap back into, oh, it's a something again. And just see how easy it is to go back and forth. And you start to discover what I call the gap. I think there's a gap for every fetter. In this case, it's that moment in time between when you first recognize something and then what you might call thingify it, when you start to interpret it and make it tangible. And you can start to not just notice that gap, but extend it out in time. Maybe it's just a half a second, but you can start to get a sense of, oh yeah, there is a lag between the time I recognize something and that I necessarily have a sense that, oh, it's a particular something. And you can start to get a sense of maybe even a physical location in your body that seems like, oh, something's happening in there. might be in the chest area, it might be in the head. But it's before I have people move on to what I call the main inquiry, I really want to make sure they have a sense of what somethingness is to them and how it comes and goes in their daily experience, but also in a controlled environment.
Mm. Yeah. I wanted to say a couple things about that. One is I really like the contrast. Sometimes I point this out to people that the fluctuations and so forth are okay. The contrast in one sense is actually how you gain the insight that, oh, that's extra information that I think I'm referencing to create that dimensional object, but where is it? Like seeing that there is no information that's being referenced. It's a habituated process, perhaps. But the other thing is, I like that you said being open or alert to there could be a central point here. There could be some subtle anchor point that's saying here. And that from there we proceed to create a three-dimensional world or objects and so forth.
Right.
And to be open to the sensory physical experience of the body, which it may be even a subtle experience, but it may well be in there that feels like an anchoring point or something.
Right. And as we talked a little bit ago, normally we just fly right past this gap moment. We just assume that in fact, it's completely unconscious assumption that, yeah, there's a part of me that is detecting, apprehending, grasping onto other actual things. And we can go through our entire lives and never question that.
Mm. Yeah. So then what is the main inquiry? Or did you want to say any more about that?
I think I was going to say, and then we move on to really focusing on looking for this perceptor, this thing detector. And it's not a whole lot different from the previous exercises. Whatever is done, it's a matter of resetting the perceptual situation. And after a moment or two, watching as whatever is initially recognized as, for example, a glass of water on a table. And just as it starts to become a something, to switch your attention from that glass of water into your own experience and look for what exactly it is just started to engage. As with other fetters, it can often help to clarify what exactly it seems to do. Does it detect? Does it apprehend? Does it perceive? What exactly does it seem to do? And if you say, oh, yes, it seems like a detector or a sensor, now you have something which seems tangible to look for, rather than just asking yourself, oh, what just happened there? What you'll find happens is that if you're looking for the detector, what you're looking for it with is the detector as well.
Right.
So it is looking for itself. It can feel like you're in this hall of mirrors or a dog chasing its tail. And it can take a while for what seems like a very unstable situation to calm down. But you'll get to the point where you can sense that detection process start to happen. But as soon as you look for, well, where's that happening? It will die back down. And if you see decisively that, wow, there really is no detection infrastructure that I have, there's no thing perceptor, that's when the fetter can fall away. Typically what will happen for the first several times at least is the what feels like a perceptual process that was starting to get going will fall away. Then it's just a matter of closing your eyes for a couple seconds, opening them back up, maybe to that same glass of water, and starting over again. It doesn't matter what it is out here that you're looking at. It's getting sensitive to what seems to be happening in here and seeing if that's actually true.
So you could almost say it's something like you mentioned in the previous Fetter, there was some kind of curtain rod. I can't remember the term you used, but something actually anchoring you away from or anchoring a subject away from an object. This is a more subtle version of that. It's like almost like an anchoring point, something referencing back as the detection apparatus, detecting anything at all.
Exactly. It can feel like a camera lens that snaps, and again, it may feel like a more passive process, and in a way it is compared to the sixth fetter, where you're subconsciously pressing yourself away from everything. Here you're still doing something, even if you haven't noticed it before.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it gets more as this goes on, as this work goes to look for more subtle perceptual filters. I find it gets much more subtle. What
Very
you're
subtle.
looking for, yeah.
Right. This is the last fetter in which you have something to work with,
Mm-hmm.
and this is you're at the level of somethingness itself. What do you consider something or a thing? So yes, it's very subtle, and what seems to be happening in here is even more difficult to notice, at least at first.
Mm-hmm.
The good news is once the sixth fetter is out of the way, the level of subtlety of your attention naturally falls down to the next level.
Mm-hmm.
After a day or two of starting to notice what seems to be happening, I think you'll find that, yes, your attention does get more subtle enough until you kind of get into the right place where you're starting to notice, oh yeah, that's what seems to happen.
Mm-hmm. So looking for the detector, and with the detector, or with what appears to be a detector.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And what happens as you're looking at this fetter is the same thing that you can experience in deep meditation. There's a meditation practice called the formless spheres, where if you can quiet your mind down enough, then layers of the perceptual process just naturally fall away. The first layer that falls away is the sense of time and space. Then the sense of consciousness, that I am conscious of something. And then the third layer that falls away is the sense of somethingness itself, where you set that aside. The fourth layer is the perception of non-perception, which means that's when you start to get into, oh, I see that I'm not seeing anything, or I perceive that I'm not perceiving anything. Mm-hmm. So even in that quiet meditation state, things can get really unstable until it settles down. Mm. It's in that meditation state that's where I saw through this fetter. Whereas most people aren't ace meditators to the point that they can not only get into what are called the formless spheres, but also have them be stable enough to do this looking. Fortunately, you don't need to. And the other good news is once the seventh fetter is gone, you will be an expert in formless meditation. Mm-hmm. Because in an instant you will verify, yes, there's no such thing as time and space, consciousness, thingness, or a thing detector. Oh, okay.
Right.
You instantly can fall into a formless state because technically you're already there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Are there any precautions you would give people or side effects of this fetter specifically or working through it?
Well, I think one of the pitfalls is this can become a conceptual exercise. Mm-hmm. As I mentioned earlier, you can start to think about, oh, that's not really a glass of water out there. I know that is a mental interpretation. As it turns out, just knowing that doesn't mean you're no longer going to believe in it. It's kind of like, oh, I see that bowl of ice cream. I know if I eat it, my cholesterol numbers will go up. But if you eat it, your cholesterol numbers will still go up. You have to stop eating it.
Yeah.
in the same way, you have to stop believing that there's something in you that's doing this interpretive exercise every time you see something.
Mm-hmm.
It's not enough just to pause it or let it die down, as in meditation, or if you just blank out your mind. You actually have to go in and see and fully experience that there's no such thing.
Mm.
Otherwise, it just becomes a conceptual exercise.
Yeah, yeah.
Right.
And so when you have worked with people with this specifically, typically they don't necessarily work in deep samadhi and meditation, but rather wide awake.
Now, I'd say only a very small minority of the people have even had those sorts of experience, much less are they able to reliably and comfortably get into those temporary states to do this work. So yes, it's almost all the people I've worked with have done this work just at an everyday level of consciousness, you might call it.
It's just astounding that that's available to really anyone that is dedicated to this kind of discernment. Yeah.
Yes. Some people I've talked to who I would assume are meditation aficionados, you might say, they can actually get upset to hear that, well, what do you mean that meditation isn't needed for this? My response is, well, I think meditation can be very valuable. It was obviously valuable for me, but I know also that you don't need to do it.
Mm-hmm.
And here's the kicker: when this fetter falls, you can't do that meditation anymore.
Yeah.
It's just, what constitutes meditation. You can't get into a temporary state where you release a certain level of mental interpretation because it's not there to release anymore.
When it's so funny you say this, like I had no context for any of this stuff, but when that happened to me, it was almost like, did I mess something up? Because there's no, it was obvious that is the case. There is no form, no perceptual distance. Like it's just obvious, but also what used to feel like meditation to me just couldn't. It was already here. It was kind of like the meditation is just already here. There's no getting into that state because it's not a state. And so the whole person getting into states paradigm went down the drain. Yeah.
Right. You should be able to just close your eyes and in a moment or two just say, yep, there's no such thing as time, space, consciousness, thingness.
Yeah.
Really what you're doing is verifying it.
Mm-hmm.
And as with most fetters, if this shifts for a period of time, days, weeks, it can seem like the thingness of life is coming back. You think the process is starting back up, just like when you see through the first three fetters, it can seem like the self is coming back. Mm-hmm. Really, it's just echoes or memories of what you remember life used to be like.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
As with any other fetter, eventually that this, it's just a display of non-tangible items. Sometimes I call them, you still recognize items out in the room. That just becomes the new normal. Mm-hmm. Like you, it sounds like when this fetter shifted, I was not prepared for it. I wasn't sure how I was going to be able to get through daily life. I started walking around the room though, and okay, I can still do this. I can still do that. And eventually I just got used to it. Mm-hmm. The good news is maybe that in terms of how the outside world is interpreted and interacted with, this is more or less the end of the line for those sorts of changes. How life looks to me today is basically just as it did when the seventh fetter fell almost 10 years ago. Mm. There's 3 steps left after this, but in terms of how things physically seem, there won't be any more significant changes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so can you give, well, I'll let you say it, but part of me wants to say there's something so definitive about this shift that you're not going to really second guess it, really. But maybe give us some sense of how someone who's not sure can test themselves, or do they get in gray? Do you see people getting into gray areas with this, where they're not quite sure? Is this conceptual? Is this actual? And so forth.
What I always do is ask people, just go through your day. Don't even think about inquiry, what you did, what you might do tomorrow. Just see how life appears to you as you go about life, your daily life. They will still remember what it is to perceive everything as tangible, real. And also now they have this sense of what probably feels like a more two-dimensional look. It's as if you're living in a movie, you might say. Just go through your daily life and see if that sense of tangibility and reality comes back or comes and goes. If it's the case, then, well, we've definitely moved in the right direction, but we're not done yet. Mm-hmm. But if after several days, this is all that's happening, I also ask people, how is your sense of time and space? It's here that you really need to set an alarm for everything. Mm-hmm. Because your internal clock, just like a grandfather clock, keeps time based on the passing of individual events. If you're not keeping track of individual events as somethings, mm-hmm. your internal clock doesn't know what time it is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Similarly, if it feels like three-dimensional space just isn't available anymore, and yet somehow you can still drive a car, that's another indication. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. This is one of the most significant shifts. I don't know if it's the most significant of the Fetter shifts, but it's definitely in the top 10.
Right.
Okay, how about top 3?
I would say probably it's yeah. It does fascinate me that different people perceive these shifts in different ways. For some of them are much more simple than for others, and less surprising or more surprising, as we'll talk about next week or whenever we meet again, because that one people respond so differently.
I would say that's number 2.
Yeah. Right. So,
yeah, and another thing about this shift mm-hmm. is when it happened to me, I was following and trying to figure out what's this list of 10 fetters. If this shift had happened without reference to that list of 10 things, I might have assumed, well, this has got to be it. Mm-hmm. I can't imagine anything more significant than this shift.
Mm. Yeah.
And then I looked at the list and said, what do you mean there's 3 left?
Right.
I mean, and there are a lot of other people that might reach the same conclusion that, this has got to be it. For example, it's my understanding that in the Advaita tradition, there are many teachers, many texts which say this is it. You get mm-hmm. down to this sense of I am. I may not be anything in particular. I don't have a sense of a mind or a body anymore, but I still am.
Yeah.
So it's, and again, once you reach the end of the 7th fetter, there's no longer anything to work with. Mm-hmm. There's nothing to use, to refer to, like, well, how do you do inquiry?
Yeah.
And we'll get into that next time. And
I would say that's right on the money. There's no anchor point. There's no reference point. The paradigm of view, of frame of reference, all of it is just out the window. You see that nothing was ever anchored anywhere. And how that could appear as a finality. Yeah, I can see very obviously how that could appear as a finality.
Right.
Yeah.
Another aspect of this is that if you don't have a sense of things that rise and fall in time and space, then the concept of impermanence or interconnectedness no longer has anything to apply to. Mm-hmm. To the extent that, as as a Buddhist, I know that in many traditions, impermanence is put forward as, well, this is something you wake up to. You see how everything is impermanent. You see how you're interconnected with everything. And I think those can be very helpful concepts at first, but they're not something you wake up to. They're something you wake up from.
Mm-hmm.
So it can be kind of jarring, and it was for me. Suddenly, impermanence didn't mean anything.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of, some spiritual truth. You can still see how things are impermanent on a conventional level. If you throw a coffee cup on a tile floor, it'll break.
Yeah.
It is impermanent. But what I realize is that, another translation for the traditional word for impermanence is not permanent. I look for permanence, reliability, predictability in life, and it's not there. It doesn't mean the opposite is true.
Right.
It just means that the whole permanent, impermanent dichotomy suddenly has no meaning and is not really of any use any longer.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that some of these guiding, orienting principles or doctrines are valuable in that they're there to dispel a very prominent illusion,
Yes.
and one that we hold on to. But at some point, you realize, well, the opposite isn't there, and so neither is the opposite of the opposite. There's just nothing there. It's not meaningful anymore.
Right.
Yeah.
And if you really hold on to the concept of impermanence, you'll naturally conclude that, okay, there's no permanent me, but there's an impermanent me that by definition I can't find because it's impermanent. Therefore, there is a me. And even getting past the first fetter can be difficult if you're using that as a reason to not look to see if there's any you whatsoever.
Oh man, that's a good point. Yeah. All right. What else? We missed anything with this?
I think we pretty much got through it. In terms of inquiry, as with all other steps, this is a matter of looking for a what, not a who. When you actually get into the looking, even with the next fetter that talks about the illusion of I or me, you'll still be looking for something, not for someone. Again, as with any other fetter, there'll be a gap, and it's a matter of figuring out what gap, or where is that gap, what happens, and then where should I stop before the next thing happens. In this case, it's, I just recognized a glass of water out there on the table. What do I normally do next that if I become sensitive to it, that next process, I can hold off on doing it and look around to see if there's something about me that I assume is true isn't actually there.
And specifically a perceptual apparatus,
perceptual apparatus, a perceptual faculty, a thing detector. One person described it as when they fully thingified something, it was like something in them leapt out and grabbed onto it. And what you'll find is that thingifying, that, this is an actual something, can be very comforting. It seems to explain what's happening, can give you a sense of predictability and safety, and more importantly, it reinforces the idea that, I exist too.
Yeah. That's the thing, is the self is always backward extrapolated. It's always in the background. It's always an inside job. All of this that we seem to be imputing on the quote unquote external world really is just an anchor point for to give that sense of self we're going to look for next time, somewhere to even start, to even orient.
Right. And once this fetter shifts, suddenly your sense of identity no longer has anything to identify with. It's got nowhere to land, nothing to point to. So this is where, again, health warning, this is where unresolved trauma can really start to come out, because ways you've managed that trauma may not work anymore.
All right. Okay, well.
So I think that covers it.
I think we did it. Okay. So next well, we'll talk after this about when we can meet again. But the next fetter, the eighth fetter, the sense of the I ams, what like traditional Advaita Vedanta would probably call the I am sense, or maybe
Yes.
Nisargadatta would call the I am sense. That's
Yeah,
what we're going to
and
address.
it's what the Buddhist tradition calls it too. It's that sense of I am, and let's see if that's real.
Okay. All right. For next time.
Spoiler alert,
Yeah.
it's not.
Right. All right. Very good. Thank you so much. I really appreciate the time.
Thank you, Angelo. These
Okay.
are